Welcome back. Some cases aren't remembered for the man who committed the crime. They're remembered for the man who almost paid for it instead. This is one of those cases. September 1990, in a jail cell in Marion County, Florida, sits a man. On paper, his charge is simple: robbing a Winn-Dixie grocery store. Less than an hour's drive away, the college town of Gainesville has its eyes fixed on someone else. An 18-year-old student, a face covered in scars, a name the local press keeps repeating as suspect number 1 in the murders of 5 college students. A case that has gripped the entire country. The man in the Marion County cell says nothing about any of it. Nobody in Gainesville knows his name. Not even the investigators, working under mounting pressure every day, have connected him to what just happened in those quiet streets near campus. It will take weeks, then months, before a blood sample says what an entire community couldn't see. The real killer had already been in their hands while they were pouring their suspicion and a piece of public justice onto a completely innocent man. This isn't only the story of Danny Rowland. It's the story of the gap between fear and evidence, and what happens to a real human being when that gap gets filled too soon. Most retellings of this case start with the killer. This one starts with the gap, because that gap is where an innocent life very nearly got crushed, quietly, while the headlines were pointing somewhere else entirely. 2 men, 1 city, one summer in 1990, and a question it would take more than a year to answer. Which of the 2 was the one to actually be afraid of? Before the world called him the Gainesville Ripper, Danny Harold Rowland was a boy growing up in an ordinary house in Shreveport, Louisiana. His father, James Rowland, was a Korean War veteran who later became a police officer. To his neighbors, to his colleagues, he was the model of an upstanding officer. Disciplined, punctual, well-respected around the block. But behind his own front door, according to his wife's later court testimony, James Rowland was a controlling, violent man. Claudia Rowland, Danny's mother, testified that her son was beaten by his father at least once or twice a week. Not a single outburst, not an isolated incident the family could write off as an exception. A rhythm, repeated year after year inside the one place that was supposed to be the safest for a child. Now we need to pause this here, because this is exactly where a story like this one is easiest to get wrong. Childhood abuse is not an explanation for what Rowland would do more than a decade later. Millions of children were beaten in their own homes, and the overwhelming majority of them never hurt anyone. There's no formula that turns an abused child into a serial killer. But this is the one piece of the record we have evidence to stand on, confirmed by Rowland's own family, under oath, in court. It doesn't explain. It's only a starting point. It's worth noting, too, that this house looked like this from the outside. James Rowland wasn't a man anyone in the neighborhood would have flagged as dangerous. He wore a badge. He kept order. That gap between the public version of a man and the private one is not unique to this family. And it's part of why this kind of violence so often goes unnoticed for years. The people closest to us had the least ability to make anyone else believe them. After high school, Rowland left home and joined the U.S. Air Force, looking perhaps like a lot of young men of his generation for structure, for a way out. The path didn't last either. He was arrested for drug possession and given a dishonorable discharge. From there, for most of the next decade of Rowland's life was a string of small-time crimes: theft, fraud, short stints in and out of jail across several states. To people who crossed paths with him during this period, he was a familiar name in the local police blotter, but not one that made anyone especially afraid. Nothing in his record up to that point hinted at what was coming at the end of 1989. This is worth sitting with, and it's not for us to answer. How many people in their own lives have walked past someone just like this version of Danny Rowling? A forgettable small-time thief with no idea what was quietly building underneath. Until one night, in the very city where he grew up. November 1989, Rowling had just been fired from a restaurant job in Shreveport. The same night, he broke into the home of the Grissom family and killed 3 people. Julie Grissom, 24, her 8-year-old nephew Sean, and her father Tom Grissom, 55. 3 lives in one night, in his own hometown. This needs to be said plainly. While the names Sonia Larson, Christina Powell, Krista Hoyt, Tracy Pauls, and Manny Taboada had not yet appeared in any newspaper, while Gainesville had not yet heard the name Danny Rowling, he was already a 3-time killer. No police department in Florida, 9 months later, knew that. May 1990, 3 months before he set foot in Gainesville, Rowling turned a gun on his own father. The man who had beaten him throughout his childhood now found himself at the other end of his son's weapon. Rowling shot him in the face. James Rowling survived, but lost an eye. This deserves more than a single sentence. 2 layers of violence in Rowling's life. The violence he had once suffered and the violence he was now actively inflicting existed side by side, and in 1989 and 1990, they escalated almost simultaneously, from the murder of 3 strangers to a gunshot aimed directly at his own father. No court record, no psychiatric testimony explains the exact moment someone moves from being a victim of abuse to being the one who inflicts violence on this scale. That's one of the real gaps in the story, and we won't pretend to fill it with an explanation that sounds plausible but has no source behind it. What we can say is only what the record shows. By the spring of 1990, Danny Rowling was no longer simply a man with a history of small crimes and a difficult childhood. He was a man who already had killed 3 people in his hometown and was capable of turning a gun on his own father. Whatever happened inside of him to get there remains, and will likely always remain, unknown. 3 months after shooting his father, Rowling left Louisiana, heading south. He arrived in Gainesville in mid-August 1990, right as tens of thousands of University of Florida students were returning to campus after summer break, renting apartments and rooms along the quiet streets near the university. A city busy with the start of a new school year. No one knew that somewhere in that crowd was a man who had already killed 3 people and shot his own father just months before. In Shreveport, the Grissom murders remained an unsolved case file. No one there had connected the name Danny Rowling to the 3 deaths in that house, and it would be yet a long time yet until Louisiana authorities began matching his saliva, hair, and blood against evidence from the scene, that they would see a link. 2 cities, 2 states, 2 separate murder files, and in the summer of 1990, not a single thread yet connecting them. Before I tell you how they died, I need to tell you who they were, because they are not just names in a case file. They were young people living their own lives. Sonia Larson, 18, and Christina Powell, 17, were freshmen at the University of Florida who had recently moved in together. 2 roommates just starting their first year away from home, like thousands of other new students in Gainesville that fall. Krista Hoyt, 18, attended Santa Fe Community College and lived alone in her apartment on the same stretch of road as the others. Tracy Pauls and Manny Taboada, both 23, were roommates and seniors at the University of Florida, at the tail end of their education, closer than ever to graduating and stepping into their adult lives they've spent years preparing for. 5 people, living in the same area, a few minutes walk from one another. None of them knew Danny Rowling. None of them had a connection to him beyond the fact that they happened to live near where he chose to stop. This detail is worth sitting with. No personal motive, no grudge, Nothing in the lives of these 5 people made them a target. By every piece of evidence available, Rowling's choice came down to simply the fact that they were there. Young, living alone or with a roommate, in homes a stranger could break into at night. It's one of the hardest truths of this kind of crime. Sometimes there's no reason to look for beyond the misfortune of being in the wrong place. That randomness is in its own way the most frightening part of what follows. A story with a motive can't be reasoned with, understood, even guarded against. A story without one leaves nothing to hold on to, which is exactly why within days, an entire community would start looking for someone, anyone, to explain what had no explanation. None of the 5 had any warning worth the name. No threatening call, no stalker, no dispute with a stranger. Just an ordinary end-of-summer week in a college town, and a man moving through it who none of them had ever met. According to the investigative record, Rowling killed Sonia Larson and Christina Powell on August 24, 1990. The next day, August 25th, it was Krista Hoyt. 2 days after that, August 27, Tracy Pauls and Manny Taboada were killed together when Rowling broke into the apartment where they lived. We won't describe what happened inside each of those homes in detail, not because the truth needs to be hidden, but because more graphic description than necessary doesn't serve the audience. It only exploits the pain of people no longer here to consent to it. One thing, however, needs to be said clearly, because it is the key to understanding everything that follows. According to the investigative record, Rowling deliberately staged some of the scenes left before he left. Not a panicked outburst followed by a frantic escape, a calculated, deliberate sequence of actions carried out with an unsettling composure. That single detail from the earliest days told investigators they weren't dealing with an isolated act of impulsive violence, but with someone who had planned, which made finding him more urgent and more frightening for the whole city. The victims' bodies were discovered one after another in the days that followed, as friends, family, and classmates couldn't reach them. Each time a new body was found, the news spread faster, and the fear in the city climbed another notch. 4 days, 5 lives, and throughout all 4 days, and for weeks afterward, no one in Gainesville knew the man or the name of the man walking among them. News of the murder spread faster than any official statement the police department could issue. Students left their dorms in the middle of the semester. Many took leaves of absence, went home to families in other states until things felt clearer. Those who stayed found every way they could to feel a little safer each night. New locks, extra lights by the front door, and for more than a few people, for the first time in their lives, a gun in their nightstand drawer. Stores selling personal safety gear and security locks in Gainesville sold out within days. This was a college town, where most residents were young people living away from home for the first time, far from their usual safety net. And now, every one of them understood that the neighbor next door, the classmate sitting behind them in the lecture hall, even the person walking past them on the street, could be the one who did this. This wasn't an overreaction, it was the reasonable response. Maybe the only reasonable response of a community that had just learned that among the familiar streets they used to walk without a second thought, a killer existed whose face no one knew. The University of Florida at the time was one of the largest universities in the country. Tens of thousands of young people, most living away from home for the very first time. In a community that size, fear didn't spread slowly. It moved like a wave through dorm room landlines, through hastily posted notices in the hallways, through phone calls home to parents in other states asking whether their kids should come back. There was nothing irrational in that fear. The problem wasn't the community's emotion. The problem was where that emotion within days would be directed. In that panic, something almost any community would go through happened. The need for an answer began moving faster than a real investigation could keep up with. Police needed to show progress. The press needed a name to report. The public needed a specific face so they could stop looking at everyone around them as a potential suspect. That pressure within days landed on one name, and it wasn't Danny Rowland. It rarely is in cases like this. The person who ends up carrying a community's fear in the early days of an unsolved crime is almost never chosen because the evidence points to them. They're chosen because something about them is easy to point at. Edward Lewis Humphrey, 18 at the time, was a former honor student and an Eagle Scout, the highest rank in American Scouting, held by only a small fraction of those who ever joined. He came from Brevard County and had just started summer classes at the University of Florida, with a future his family had every reason to be proud of. He lived not far from the victims. His face carried scars left over from 2 prior car accidents. He was on lithium for a mood disorder, and the medication left his face swollen, tired-looking, unwell. According to some acquaintances, he had been known to carry knives for personal reasons that had nothing to do with the case. And according to some reporting on the investigation, he vaguely matched the criminal profile the FBI was circulating internally at the time. For a community in a state of panic, needing a face to attach to its fear, those details, the scars, the medication-swollen face, rumors about a knife, a vague match to a profile, were already more than enough. Investigators began receiving a wave of tips pointing at Humphrey. His name started appearing on local news tied to the murders of 5 college students, before anyone, including the police themselves, had proven anything concrete. It should be stressed, the police at the time never declared Humphrey the killer. But in a case the entire country was watching, simply having his name mentioned as someone under scrutiny was enough to turn him into a suspect in the public's eyes. A gap between being looked at and having been convicted that in the newspapers and in the mind of a panic community all but disappeared. Then, just one day after the last of the 5 bodies was found, Humphrey was arrested. Not for murder. He was arrested for assaulting his own grandmother, 79 years old, at her home in Indialantic. A real incident occurring while he was going through a serious psychological crisis, and entirely separate legally from the Gainesville case. But in the public mind at the time, that legal distinction barely existed. For a lot of people, the news simply read, "A suspect has been arrested." This is a point worth dwelling on longer than a single sentence, because it is the heart of this story. Edward Humphrey was never charged with murder. No formal indictment was ever brought against him on the case of the 5 suspects. But in the public's perception, in the newspapers, in conversations over coffee, in the fear gripping an entire city, he was treated as the prime suspect for months. He was sentenced to 22 months for assaulting his grandmother, a real conviction for a real charge, entirely separate from the murders. But he served that sentence under the shadow of a suspicion he had no way to publicly clear. There was no trial in Gainesville for him to win, because no indictment was ever filed for him to defend himself against. He was simply left hanging, in the eyes of an entire community, not because of a verdict, but because of a suspicion that was never officially confirmed or officially cleared for months on end. No source tells us exactly what Humphrey felt during that time, and we won't speculate on his behalf. But there is one objective fact that requires no speculation at all. While the evidence that would actually lead to the real killer was quietly being gathered in another county, the only name the public of Gainesville held onto week after week was Edward Humphrey. consider what that meant in practical terms. A young man already managing a serious mental health condition, already recovering from facial injuries, was now also carrying the weight of an entire city's suspicion, with no courtroom, no verdict, no formal process available to him to make it stop. There is no tidy ending to attach to this part of the story while it was happening. It simply continued, month after month, with no update that resolved it one way or the other, which for a family watching their son and brother carry that weight may have been its own kind of ongoing harm. While Humphrey's name filled the local press, something almost entirely unrelated was unfolding less than an hour's drive away. Not long after the murders, Danny Rolling was arrested for robbing a Winn-Dixie grocery store in Marion County. Now, this wasn't the result of an investigation targeting him over any suspected link in Gainesville. It was simply a robbery, caught in the act. One of hundreds of minor criminal cases that happen in Florida every year. No one on the arresting team that day knew they had just caught the man the entire state was hunting. Not long after, in Tampa, Rolling was convicted again. On August 29, 1991, on 3 counts of armed robbery, 1 count of attempted robbery, and 3 counts of aggravated assault against law enforcement officers, stemming from another grocery store robbery in Tampa, also in September of 1990. He was shuffled from one cell to another, one minor case to the next, a serial killer moving through the Florida justice system under the name of entirely different charges, while his real identity, tied to the 5 deaths in Gainesville, still hadn't surfaced in a single piece of court paperwork. On September 18, 1991, at a hearing in Ocala, Judge Thomas Sawaya sentenced Rolling to life in prison as a habitual violent offender for the Winn-Dixie robbery, plus 30 years for possessing a firearm as a convicted felon, the second sentence running concurrent with the life term. The prosecutor on the case, Rock Hooker, told reporters plainly that this sentence was meant to be a true life. He's not supposed to get out until he's dead. When the judge asked Rolling if he had anything to say, he replied, showing no emotion, "God bless the people of Florida and let the Lord help me." Not one word about the 5 students who had died not far away. This is the paradox at the center of this entire story. While a city not far away was still hunting a killer it couldn't identify, that killer had already been in prison under a different name, on a different charge for months. Meanwhile, investigators in Gainesville kept working, more patiently, and far more quietly than what the public was going through. They gathered forensic evidence from the scenes, tool marks left by the break-ins, biological samples recovered on site. DNA testing in 1990 was still relatively new to American criminal investigation. New enough that many police departments at the time had no standard procedure for using it routinely. But in this case, it was enough to change everything. When Rolling's criminal record, the man sitting in jail for the Marion County robbery, was cross-checked, investigators found that the burglary tools used for that robbery matched the tool marks left at the Gainesville murder scenes. Biological samples from the crime scenes were then tested, and the results matched Rolling. On that very same day, September 18, 1991, the day Rolling was sentenced to life for robbery, Edward Humphrey was released from the state prison in Lake Butler, where he'd been serving his sentence for assaulting his grandmother. 2 men, both bound in the public mind with a single case, walking through 2 different prison doors on the same day, one walking out, the other one walking into an even heavier sentence for his own separate charges. Neither of them knew at that moment that less than 2 months later, one of those two names would officially become the sole suspect in the murders of 5 college students. In November 1991, more than a year after the murders, more than a year after the city first learned the name Edward Humphrey, Danny Rolling was formally indicted on 5 counts of murder in Gainesville after prosecutors presented evidence to an Alachua County grand jury. 1 year. That's how long a city lived in constant fear, how long a family lived under the shadow of a suspicion never formally named. Before forensic science, not intuition, not rumor, not the need for a quick answer, finally told the truth. It's worth pausing on how ordinary the break actually was. There was no dramatic confession, no chase, no moment of the killer slipping up under pressure. There was only a lab technician at some point in that year matching one sample against another, and a case file that had been sitting under a different name suddenly opening onto an entirely different story. By the time Rolling was formally indicted in November 1991, Edward Humphrey had already been free for a few weeks. Prosecutors in Gainesville, according to public records, acknowledged that the evidence against Humphrey in the murder case was purely circumstantial, not enough to bring any formal charge. His attorney, Don Lickeback, at the time of Humphrey's release, told reporters plainly that he didn't believe the grand jury would indict his client, and that, without naming him directly, the other person was the one he expected to be charged. He was right. Humphrey, at the press conference shortly after his release, said only that he felt overwhelmed by months of intense media attention and hoped this would be the last time he'd have to face it. He talked about his immediate plans: plastic surgery to reduce the scars on his face, the very scars that helped make him a suspect in the public eye, and moving in with his older brother George in Orlando before returning to college. He was never cleared with a formal declaration of innocence in court because he was never put on trial in this case for such a declaration to be made. His innocence is confirmed in the quietest way possible. When the indictment finally came, it carried a different name. According to later reporting, Humphrey continued stabilizing his mental health, graduated from a community college in 1994, then worked while studying part-time, and eventually graduated magna cum laude from the University of Central Florida in 2000. A quiet recovery, followed by no camera, the way his months as a suspect had been. No court ever declared Edward Humphrey as innocent through a formal verdict, simply because he was never tried in a way that would require one. But there is a plain, uncontested fact. The public record contains no murder indictment against him whatsoever, and the only person ever charged, tried, and convicted for the 5 deaths in Gainesville is Danny Rolling. On February 15, 1994, just as his trial was about to begin, Rolling pleaded guilty to all 5 murder charges. There was no lengthy guilt-faced trial for the public to have waited for more than 3 years. What remained was only the sentencing phase, where a jury had to choose between the death penalty and life in prison. There's something worth noting about the guilty plea itself. It took away the public's chance, and perhaps to some degree the victim's family's chance, to hear the full body of evidence laid out publicly, detail by detail, in a complete trial. By pleading guilty right as the trial was set to start, Rolling held on to a piece of control over how his own story would be told to the public, even in the moment he admitted his guilt. During that sentencing phase, Rolling's mother Claudia testified again, describing once more what she had witnessed in the house in Shreveport years earlier, the pattern of abuse her son endured throughout his childhood. And a psychiatric expert testified as well, describing a second personality Rolling himself claimed existed inside of him, one he called Gemini, which he said had driven him to commit the most brutal of his acts. This is where the story needs to be told with the most care. Gemini was a claim made by Rowling himself, presented in court by an expert as part of a defense strategy aimed at reducing his sentence. That is sourced information. It really was presented to the jury under a professional witness oath. But in the years since, many journalists who followed the case, and some forensic psychiatrists as well, have publicly questioned whether this was a genuine mental disorder or a role deliberately constructed by a killer who understood the justice system well, offered at the exact moment he needed the jury to see a reason not to impose the death penalty. We have no evidence to confirm which of those two possibilities is true, and we won't pretend to. The one thing that can be said with certainty is this: whether Gemini was real or not, it was Rowling himself, not some other personality who planned the break-ins, who brought the weapon, and who carried out every act over 4 days in Gainesville and on that fatal night in Shreveport. In the end, the jury didn't let a psychological explanation stand in for that responsibility. This remains one of the real gaps in this case. Not a gap that needs to be filled with speculation, but one that should be left exactly as it is. Because that very ambiguity is part of what Rowling left behind. A story where, in the end, no one, not even the experts who sat across him for hours, could say with certainty which parts were the real man and which were the final performance of someone who always knew how to control the story told about himself. After 4 hours of deliberation, on March 24, 1994, the jury recommended the death penalty. Nearly a month later, on April 20, 1994, Judge Stan R. Morris formally sentenced Danny Rowling to death. For the families, who had waited more than 3 years for this moment, the sentence closed one chapter. It did not and could not answer the question that had shadowed the entire case from the beginning: why any of this had happened at all. Rowling spent more than a decade on death row as appeals were filed and denied one after the other. During that time, he gradually confessed to crimes he had never been formally charged with: the murder of the 3 members of the Grissom family in Shreveport in 1989, and the shooting of his own father in 1990. Combined with the 5 victims in Gainesville, Rowling ultimately admitted to taking 8 lives. Shortly before his execution, Rowling handed his spiritual advisor a handwritten confession detailing the Shreveport murders, closing, though very belatedly, a chapter the Grissom family had lived with for 17 years without an official answer. Throughout that decade of waiting, the victims' families of the 5 students in Gainesville and of the 3 members of the Grissom family in Shreveport lived with a reality few people can imagine. The man who killed their loved one was still alive, still breathing, still waiting for the final legal proceedings to run their course, while the people they had lost no longer had anything left to wait for. On October 25, 2006, Danny Rowling was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. Asked if he had any final words, he offered no explanation, no direct apology to the family sitting in the witness room. According to those present, he sang a hymn, repeating a single line, while the victims' relatives who had waited 16 years for this moment sat in silence until the very end. That was the last image he left the world. Not a clear, remorseful confession of what he had taken from 5 families and from the city of Gainesville, but a performance carried all the way to his final moment of his life. The families in that room didn't get an explanation. They got a hymn. Whatever closure the execution provided, it wasn't the kind that comes from understanding why. There are many ways to tell this story. Most chose to tell it as the story of a monster and how he was finally brought down. But if that's the only way we tell it, we miss the most important part of the whole story. For weeks, then months, a community nearly staked its certainty on the wrong name. Not because anyone meant to harm Edward Humphrey, but because fear, once it grows large enough, always needs an answer to arrive faster than the truth actually can. The truth, in this case, didn't come from the crowd's instinct, didn't come from a face that looked suspicious. It came from a blood sample, matched quietly and patiently by people who didn't need to prove anything to the public. And the only person ultimately charged, tried, and convicted was the only person the evidence actually led to. Nothing more, nothing less. That might be the thing worth carrying away from this, more than the name Danny Rolling. Next time a community, any community, at any moment, needs a face to pin its fear on, maybe the question worth asking isn't who looks the most like him, but what evidence do we actually have? Edward Humphrey didn't need anyone to retell his story in order to keep living. He did that himself, quietly, far from any camera, in the years after his release. But perhaps more than a decade later, he deserves to be part of the story, not as a footnote to the Danny Rolling case, but as part of the reason this case is worth telling again, right now.